There are places in this world that time forgets, places where the clock stopped ticking long ago, where the air itself seems to hold its breath, waiting. Most of us will never set foot in such a place. But in 2024, a small team of estate archivists, legal representatives, and preservation specialists did exactly that. They walked into a space that had been sealed, locked, and deliberately kept away from the world for more than 15 years. They walked into Michael Jackson's private garage at Neverland Ranch, and what they found inside did not just surprise them. It shook them to their core. This is not a story about cars. This is not a story about money or memorabilia or auction houses bidding on the remnants of a fallen king. This is a story about a human being, a deeply complex, endlessly creative, profoundly private human being who spent the better part of his adult life building walls between himself and the world that claimed to love him. And somewhere behind those walls, behind that rusted door and that custom-forged lock, was the version of Michael Jackson that the cameras never caught. The version that existed only when the lights went down and the crowd went home. What they found inside that garage was not just a collection of objects. It was a map, a private, intimate, heartbreaking map of a man's inner world. And once you hear what was in there, you will never think about Michael Jackson the same way again. To understand why the garage matters, you first have to understand what Neverland became after Michael Jackson died on June 25, 2009. In life, Neverland Ranch was unlike anything else on Earth. Spread across approximately 2,700 acres in the Santa Ynez Valley of California, the estate was part theme park, part zoo, part film set, and part personal refuge. There were carnival rides that operated day and night. There were exotic animals. There were manicured gardens, a private railroad, a movie theater, and a main residence that looked less like a home and more like a palace dreamed up by a child who had never been told that anything was impossible. But when Michael died, all of that began to unravel. The carnival rides stopped spinning. The animals were relocated. The gardens grew wild. The lights went out one by one, and Neverland transformed from a living, breathing world into something closer to a monument. A monument to excess, certainly, but also to loneliness, to the strange and terrible cost of being the most famous person on the planet for 30 consecutive years. Legal disputes over the estate dragged on for years after his death. The property changed hands, fell into disrepair, was partially renovated, then left dormant again. For a long stretch, it seemed as though Neverland would simply be swallowed by time, its stories dissolving into rumor and myth. And for the most part, the public accepted that. The rides were gone. The animals were gone. The music had moved on, but the garage had never been opened. That fact, quiet and almost unremarkable on the surface, became the subject of intense speculation among those who knew the estate best. Former staff members mentioned it in interviews. Legal representatives noted its existence in property inventories, but listed its contents as unknown. Even members of the Jackson family, when asked, would grow vague on the subject. The garage was simply there, sealed and silent, like a secret that everyone knew existed but nobody was willing to speak aloud. Before we step inside that garage, we need to talk about who built it and why. Because the garage did not happen by accident. Nothing in Michael Jackson's life ever did. People who worked closely with Michael over the years consistently described the same quality in him, an almost obsessive need for control. Not in a malicious sense, but in the way that all true artists need control. The way a painter needs to control the light in his studio. The way a composer needs silence before sound. Michael Jackson was, at his core, a perfectionist of the highest order, someone who understood instinctively that creativity requires sanctuary, that the best ideas don't come when you're being watched. They come in the quiet moments, the in-between moments, the moments nobody else gets to see. This was a man who, by the time he was 10 years old, had already spent years performing on stages across America with the Jackson 5. By the time he was a teenager, he had already appeared on national television more times than most entertainers do in a lifetime. And by the time he released Thriller in 1982, he had become something that the English language barely has a word for. Not just famous, not just successful. He had become a cultural phenomenon so large that it bent reality around itself. But fame at that level comes with a cost that is almost impossible to calculate. It means that you cannot go to a grocery store. It means that you cannot walk down a street, sit in a park, or eat at a restaurant without your presence becoming an event. It means that every room you walk into changes the moment you enter it. People stop being themselves around you. They become performers of their own admiration. And gradually, the ordinary world, the world of small pleasures and quiet moments, becomes completely inaccessible to you. Been seen since. Thriller had already made history. The world had already turned its attention to him in a way that no single artist had ever experienced. And in that moment of absolute, almost incomprehensible success, Michael Jackson chose this car. Not a flashy sports car. Not something built for speed or spectacle. A Rolls-Royce Corniche, a car known above all else for its quietness, for the way it separates its occupant from the world outside. Inside the car, the team found something small but deeply revealing. Tucked in the cassette deck, partially ejected, was an old tape. The label was worn but still readable. It was a recording of one of Michael's own songs, paused mid-play. The image of a man sitting alone in that quiet car, listening to his own music not as a performer reviewing his work but as a private individual experiencing it, is one that stays with you. Moving deeper into the garage, the team encountered a 1954 Cadillac Fleetwood. The Fleetwood had long been associated with American power and prestige, a car chosen by presidents and Hollywood legends, a car that communicated authority and permanence. Michael's ownership of this vehicle spoke to a side of him that his public image sometimes obscured, his profound interest in history, in legacy, in the idea of creating something that would outlast the moment of its creation. Beyond the Cadillac sat a silver cloud Rolls-Royce, one of only a few hundred ever manufactured. Its rarity was not incidental. Michael Jackson was drawn to things that existed outside the ordinary world, things that defied mass production and standardization, things made with human hands for specific, considered purposes. The silver cloud was exactly that kind of object. And then there was the vehicle that silenced the room most completely. A Phantom 6, its exterior finished in matte black, its windows replaced in the rear cabin with high-definition interior screens. This was a car that had been custom-modified to ensure that the person inside it could see out while no one could see in. A car built, in other words, for someone who had become so visible to the world that the only way to move through it was to render themselves invisible. There's something quietly devastating about that modification when you sit with it long enough. The luxury vehicles were extraordinary, but they were, in a sense, expected. Michael Jackson was one of the wealthiest entertainers in history. The existence of rare and custom-built cars in his private collection was, if surprising in its details, not surprising in its broad outline. What was not expected was the van. Tucked into a far corner of the garage, almost hidden behind the grander vehicles, was a 1993 Ford Econoline. Beige, unmarked, completely ordinary from the outside. The kind of vehicle that blends into any parking lot in America without a second glance. The kind of vehicle that, under almost any other circumstances, would have no business being in the same room as a Phantom 6 or a Silver Cloud. But when the sliding door was pulled open, the interior told an entirely different story. The walls were lined with deep blue velvet. The seats were custom leather, generously padded, designed for long, comfortable journeys. Each seat had its own small television monitor, and at the center of the van's interior, mounted and wired with obvious care and deliberateness, was a Super Nintendo Entertainment System, complete with a collection of original game cartridges, each one labeled and organized in individual compartments. Above, a mirrored panel covered the ceiling, creating the strange effect of making the small space feel both intimate and expansive at once. This van was, by any reasonable interpretation, Michael Jackson's hiding place. Not from his enemies or from the press, but from himself. From the version of himself that had to be the king of pop every day. Because in this van, with its velvet walls and its video games and its soft leather seats, he could be something simpler. Something closer to what he might have been if the world had let him grow up in private. Inside the van, tucked into a side pouch near one of the seats, the team found a notebook. Its cover was worn from handling. Its pages were filled with handwriting, sketches, and diagrams. Stage designs for concerts that were never built. Notes for a children's book that was never completed. Ideas scattered across pages like seeds that never got the chance to grow. The notebook was not the work of a superstar managing a brand. It was the work of a person who could not stop creating, even when no one was watching. Especially when no one was watching. Further into the garage, behind a motorcycle covered with a tarp that had turned stiff and gray with age, the team found a stack of black crates. Each one bore the MJJ Productions logo, the imprint of Michael Jackson's own creative company. The crates were sealed, but not locked. When the archivists opened them, they found documents. Blueprints, specifically. Vast, detailed, technically sophisticated schematics for concert stages of a scale that staggered the imagination. The team spread the plans across the hood of one of the cars to get a full view, and what they saw was, by all accounts, unlike anything that had ever been realized in the history of live performance. Michael's response to this was Neverland, and within Neverland, his response was a garage, a space within a space, a sanctuary within a sanctuary, a place so private that even the people who worked for him daily were not permitted inside. The garage itself was not built to impress visitors. That much was clear from its exterior. While the main house at Neverland featured soaring windows and grand architectural flourishes, the garage was deliberately understated. A reinforced structure tucked behind the main residence, its design communicated one thing above all else: stay out. The door was custom-made, fitted with a locking mechanism that went far beyond anything a standard residential property would require. Those who attempted to open it in 2024 described the experience as humbling. Specialists who had worked with high-security vaults and government facilities found themselves at a loss. The lock had been designed not merely to resist intrusion but to resist time itself, as though whoever commissioned it understood that the door might not be opened for a very long while. When it finally gave way, the sound it made was described by one team member as something between a groan and a sigh, as though the building itself had been holding its breath. The air that rushed out was thick and still. It carried the faint smell of motor oil, aged leather, and something harder to name. Something like memory. The team stood for a moment at the threshold before moving inside, their flashlights cutting long yellow beams through the darkness. And what those beams revealed, piece by piece, as the team moved further into the space, was something none of them were fully prepared for. The vehicles came into view gradually, like figures emerging from fog, and each one, as it resolved out of the darkness, carried with it a kind of gravity. These were not simply expensive automobiles left in storage. They were, as one archivist later noted, biographical objects, physical chapters in a life story told without words. The first vehicle to fully emerge into the beam of the flashlights was a 1985 Rolls-Royce Corniche. Even after 15 years untouched, it was stunning. Its exterior, a deep and unmistakable turquoise, retained a luminosity that seemed almost defiant against the dust and years. The bodywork was flawless. The white leather interior, visible through the window glass, appeared fresh, unmarked, preserved as though the car had simply been parked an hour ago rather than sealed away for a decade and a half. This car was significant for reasons that went beyond aesthetics. The Corniche was purchased by Michael Jackson in the mid-1980s, at the precise moment when his career was operating at a level that had never been seen before and is arguably never. One document was labeled with the working title History 2. A proposed follow-up tour to the History World Tour of the mid-1990s, which had itself been one of the highest-grossing concert tours ever mounted. But where that tour had been ambitious, this proposed follow-up was visionary in a way that the technology of its time would have struggled to support. The stage designs included multi-level platforms connected by mechanized elevators, lighting systems engineered to project imagery across the entire interior of a stadium, effectively turning the venue itself into a screen. Notes in the margins, written in a hand that those familiar with Michael's writing immediately recognized, spoke of audience participation elements, of creating experiences for concertgoers that went beyond watching and into something closer, to full immersion. This tour never happened. The reasons were many and complicated, involving legal difficulties, health concerns, financial disputes, and the relentless pressure of a public life that was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. But the blueprints remained, carefully preserved, sealed in their crates, waiting in the dark. When news of the garage's contents became known to a limited circle of collectors, historians, and cultural commentators, the response was not the explosive global spectacle one might expect. It was something quieter than that, more considered, because what the garage contained was not scandal. It was not the kind of revelation that feeds tabloid cycles or generates outrage. What it contained was something much more difficult to process. Evidence of a profound and genuine humanity in a person who had been so thoroughly transformed by fame that his humanity had become, for many people, almost theoretical. The cars tell a story about a man who understood that the world outside his windows was a place where he could not safely exist, and who responded to that knowledge by building increasingly elaborate shelters for himself. From the quiet sanctuary of the Corniche to the windowless digital cocoon of the Phantom 6, the vehicles trace an arc from a young artist seeking refuge in silence to a private individual essentially disappearing behind glass and screens. The van tells a different story. It tells the story of someone who never fully lost the simpler self beneath the legend. The person who wanted to play video games and sketch ideas in a notebook, and sit in a velvet-lined space where nobody could see him or need anything from him. And the blueprints tell perhaps the most poignant story of all. They tell the story of a creator who never stopped, who, even in the periods of his life most marked by legal trouble and personal suffering, was drawing stages in his mind and imagining the next great thing he was going to build. The work was always there, continuous and unstoppable, whether the world was watching or not.